Daryl's career has spanned 2 centuries, if not millennia. He has worked a variety of roles within the IT industry, and one day he may even pick one and stick with it. Today, however, is not that day. Dave is going to tell us about how one person's Ansible is another person's pyinfra. Take it away, Dave. Daryl, sorry.
I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide region, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank our interstate and overseas visitors for visiting my home state. It's lovely to have you here, and you should definitely come back when it's a lot warmer. Preferably when we're not on fire though. As an ex-CFS member, I'm qualified to say that. I would also like to acknowledge my employers, if they're watching. Technically I'm self-employed, but people pay me money to do things to their computers, and my views probably don't represent theirs. And I also would like to ask for questions at the end of the talk. I'm a little bit nervous up here, this is the first time for me, so quite easily derailed in my thoughts. I'd also like to add too that the GitHub repo isn't ready yet. The talk will be uploaded probably in the next couple of days, so don't hit it yet. So I'm going to make some assumptions that you probably all got a passing understanding of Python, and you probably all got a passing understanding of Ansible, which was why you're here. If you're thinking this is an Ansible beginner's talk, not quite. And I'm not really seeking to convert you, I'm just providing an alternate point of view. So previous talk titles that I've wrestled with is, yes, what you see here. These are the more family-friendly ones. And to be clear, these are talk titles that were rejected by myself, not by the program chair. The program chair here has been lovely. I've been struggling with a theme of this talk, and it's something I wrestle with constantly because I'm very OCD about diving into problems and problems that I perceive. So this is kind of what that talk's about, but I still haven't got basically the essence or the zen of this talk out yet, so still a work in progress. So it's also sort of documenting my struggles with Ansible over the years, and so which will lead me, I guess, to confession time, which is what this talk currently kind of is. I struggle with Ansible. Like, I've been using it for probably 5 years now, and not what it does or what it is, but more how it does what it does. I find Ansible tends to be a tool. There are some tools that sort of fit into this model where you're trying to solve a problem and you have to think about that problem in terms of the tool that you're using against it. And I find that quite often that was my case with Ansible, is like I'd have to structure it in terms of the way Ansible thinks to do things. And it caused a fair bit of cognitive workload on myself doing that, just having to deal with, I won't call them shortcomings, it's the way Ansible's been developed and grown over the years. And it takes away the workload from actually thinking about the problem itself. Some of the cognitive workloads that I mentioned, keeping track of global state, that sort of makes me feel like my old GW Basic days. And to be fair, I came to GW Basic after I'd worked in other basics that had things like local variables and named subroutines. So it was going back and trying to have to think of global variables again. And when to and when to not Jinja. Jinja quoting still kicks my butt on a regular basis. The obtuse error messages, and this is obtuse error message is more a case of if you've forgotten to download a collection that you're using, you will come up with a rather bizarre error. It's the equivalent of a code smell, but in the design space. because it's a parsing issue when that happens, and it's sort of, again, when it occurs, I have to think about it and think, why are you doing that? Is it something I've coded wrong? And it's like, oh no, I've just forgotten to incorporate the correct collection. Data structures, I tend to, a lot of my playbooks tend to be, well, complicated playbooks tend to be build data structures around how I want things to be deployed. When they start getting moderately complex and coupled with templating, it gets pretty messy pretty quickly. Include tasks versus import tasks. I struggle with that all the time. I can never remember when to do which. I've always got to look up the documentation for that. Nested looping is probably also my favourite. There is many ways to do it in Ansible. Not necessarily every way is equal. There are just some dead ends that you'll go to, well, they're not dead ends until you've actually gone down them, and then you'll realise, no, I should have handled this differently. So I tend to think long and hard about these things. I spend a lot of time lying awake at night staring at my ceiling. I shouldn't do that. I should have hobbies, but I'd only waste them. So while I was sitting there, and again, I tend to like research these things and trying to dig into the nature of what it is. Somewhere between giving the previous version of this talk and this one, which was probably about a year ago now, in the Python local Adelaide users group, I came across this quote, which sort of sealed the deal for me. It was like, yeah, it was quite an eye-opener. And it did actually appeal to me. It was pretty much a light bulb moment when I came across this. Ironically, coincidentally, the gent in question talking about this was talking about Ansible. And I wasn't actually researching Ansible stuff in the time. I was just happened to be looking for something else. But when I came across this, it was just like, oh, okay, he's suffering from similar issues with Ansible. And I was finding there's actually a small group of us like that are struggling with some of these issues. This is sounding like a self-help group. Sorry about that. And coincidentally, while I was sort of looking for a new product to pick up, I'd already picked it up by this stage, and he was also talking about the same product. Hello?
There's just a fair bit of noise coming through the microphone. Can we adjust that, Chris?
Certainly.
So,
you have my permission to touch me. Okay. It's me. It's my... oh, now I can hear myself. That's worse. Please don't do that.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. It could be my metal implants. Maybe I'll just try not to move so much. Was that better? I would just... This is going to be awkward. So I was reading Loic's blog post. He was talking about problems with Ansible, but he was also saying, oh, I've also found this solution, which I'd already started dabbling in. And by dabbling, I mean actually wholeheartedly committing. And the thing in question was pyinfra. When I came across pyinfra, I sort of went, ooh, because it's rare that I do that for a project these days. But it was it was solving a lot of, no, solving's probably not the correct word, but it was covering a lot of the pain points that I was having with Ansible. Basically, it's very similar. It runs in the sort of the same problem space as Ansible. It's an agentless orchestration tool, idempotent for the most part. You can still sort of work around that, but that's something you shouldn't do. And it has inventories and playbooks, well, the equivalent of playbooks, but they're all written in Python. So generally, it's it's a similar model to Python. It runs basically on a control node. Python, Ansible. However, it sort of differs from Ansible. Ansible tends to upload, well, not tends to, Ansible compiles a module, uploads it to the remote end, and runs it, expects you to have Python on there. PyInfra doesn't. PyInfra just expects a working shell of some sort. It SSHs across, and not necessarily just SSH, it has a whole bunch of connectors, but SSH is one of them and is the default one. Executes a bunch of commands on there, copies the results back, or retrieves the results back, and then processes that and then continues on from there. It has facts for doing a lot of that. So it will use the facts to determine the current state. If you structure your deploy correctly, it'll use facts to determine the current state of the system, then apply a set of operations to bring it to the desired state that you want. So this is where the idempotency comes in. Idempotency? Sorry, practice that word and I still have struggle speaking it out loud. So this is where the idempotency comes in, where you would sit there, if you re-execute a playbook and there's no changes to be made, it should not make any changes to that, to the desired state of the system. I was saying before, it has connectors, what it calls connectors. So SSH is usually the bog standard one you use, unless you're talking to your local machine, and it's got a specific one called local for that. Basically, a connector is any means that it can use to talk to the remote endpoint. Other connectors that it includes are connectors for Docker, Terraform, WinRM, and there's a few others as well which completely escape my mind. The SSH sessions remain open for the duration of the run. If you run Ansible and your playbook has multiple plays in it, it tends to do an SSH connection for each one. If you've got, like some environments I've worked in previously, sorry, waving to a colleague there, ex-colleague. No. For SSH connections, if you're spawning off a bunch of them, it can actually create quite a workload behind. Sorry, that's me making noises again. Sorry, I don't think I can keep still. If you spawn a large bunch of SSH connections, you can actually create quite the workload behind on your authentication back-end system. So with this, it spawns the SSH connection, but it remains for the duration of the entire run. It doesn't sit there and reconnect. It also opens SSH in a slightly different mode to what Ansible does. Ansible is quite noisy. If you do, for example, it logs in using a regular user login account. So if you do a who on the system afterwards, you can see you've just done an Ansible run because your Ansible user is logged in quite often. This uses SSH in more of the remote connect mode, like when you're typing SSH hostname command. So it doesn't actually appear in your login, but it still appears in your auth logs if you need to go back and do any sort of research for that. So as I was saying, it uses the remote shell at the far end. It's not particularly wedded to the remote shell that you use. It's got a variety of different sort of plugins where you can sit there and dependent on your back-end shell that you connect to. You could be connecting to some proprietary device, like a switch, for example, and its particular set of commands to use for that. The deploy process runs as two passes. So the initial run sits there, executes all the code, gathers all the facts that it requires to do that, and it builds up a set of operations. And then the second part just blats those operations on top of the system to bring it into the state that's required. So I present to you a concrete example. This is a lab maintenance script, I call it, a home lab maintenance script that I used. So I run a small set of VPSs and whatnot. I quite often SSH into them, as we all probably do. But what I don't want to see when I SSH into them is that. Or usually I don't want to see the initial connect message. So the initial connect message is usually, you've never logged into this host before, do you want to? And it's like, I think it's the host I'm connecting to. I always have that moment of doubt. Dagnabbit. Now I can hear it. Sorry, guys. I always have that moment of doubt. logging into it, and I know of a previous Linux conference where someone did do that and ignored the warning and were subsequently slightly pwned. So for SSH key hygiene, I tend to now be quite security conscious. I tend to make sure that I populate my global known hosts' SSH keys with all the keys of the machines I'm connecting to, so that when I do connect to them, if I ever get a scary message like before, I know something is really wrong. And I never get the, you're connecting to this machine for the first time. Sorry, just... So host names, this is, good Lord, my slide is incredibly small. Sorry, I've got to peer around at this one. So this is what we're manipulating. The top one is the name of, is the public known hosts, or sorry, the public host key that the server will be known by. And what we've got to do is get the contents of that into the SSH known host file, the global one. Slight wrinkle these days is that we hash the host names because security. I'm not 100% sure why, but it's probably, if they do it, it must be a good reason. So we don't tend to keep the host names in the clear these days anymore. The other key point there is that there's also the, in the SSH known host file, there's the hashed host name, there's the key type and the key value. And usually there's a bunch of key types per host. So this is the Ansible playbook that I originally had for it. And to fit it, I've stripped out a lot of the comments, and now when I go back to look at it, I quite often find it quite difficult to read without the comments, which is part of the whole beef of this talk. So this playbook, basically, it logs into the, well, it uses, it fetches from the remote host the list of files that we need to get. Actually, prior to that, sorry, we know the remote host by one of three ways. We know it by its fully qualified domain name. It's fully qualified domain name with a dot on the end of it, and there's good DNS reasons for that, which I won't go into here. And then it's also known by its IP address, which is the long convoluted host vars underneath it. We then connect to the server and we get a list of the public key files that we want to bring back across. We then use slurp to fetch them. Slurp brings them back as a base64 encoded file because it's not, it's only ASCII clean, the connection. So we retrieve the key back. Or actually, we retrieve all parts of the public file. The next step then splits it up. God, this is boring me even. It's not boring, it's a lot of detail, and what I find, and this is partly what I'm trying to convey, is what I find is that with the comment strip, I get confused as to what it's doing easily, and I have to stare at it for quite a while. And again, it's the problem I'm trying to solve, not the problem I'm trying to solve in the tool that I'm trying to solve it with. There's all sorts of chicanery in here. There's the use of default for the SSH host key, because the SSH host key, when you do the original pass through it, is blank, or it actually doesn't exist. So if you don't have the default, Ansible then throws an error and saying this key has never been used before, and it's like, well, I'm just looping through it. Typically, if I was doing this in Python, I'd just set the variable beforehand so I know its default state and then proceed through it. And this goes on. This then gets to the end of it, the wedge of the matter, I guess. This then actually updates the known host file. We do this on the local machine. We have delegate to on localhost, which says for all the data you've just collected from all the remote machines, we're now just applying it to, in this case, it's usually the laptop that I'm running it from. We're doing a lot of looping. We're doing looping with products. And again, if I don't go back and review the Ansible documentation I think, what is it I'm doing here? It just slips out. We also have then loop control where we can sit there and as Ansible is looping through it, it sits there and reports only on a subset of the information. Otherwise, it just tends to blurt out a great deal of noise onto the screen, and if something breaks, you're not actually sure what's broken. So I come to, there's some ways you can work around this, like you can deploy, you can modularize stuff to tasks. But again, once you do so, you've got to sit there and you've got to be aware of what variables are going into and out of tasks. You've got to track that yourself. You know, we have methods in Python where you can pass in local variables. These are things I don't have to worry about. These are just things that occurred naturally to me when I'm coding. It's like, but when I'm coding in Ansible, I've got to like, no, I can't do it that way. I have to track all of this state myself. That's the computer's job. I don't want to be doing the computer's job. I've got other things to do. Stare at my ceiling. So, again, as I'm obsessing over this, I love this quote. It's from an old webcomic, which no longer exists, unfortunately, but I still talk to Bill Barnes occasionally. Owen's the program manager and Desmond's the programmer. And this is one of the things I struggled with, is like, this is part of my struggle with this whole concept is I'm still writing code, you know, and part of Ansible's reason was to be able to be usable by the every person. Sorry, that's gender inappropriate. Usable by everyone. It should be relatively simple to put together. And for simple cases, Ansible is quite simple. But when you get to start doing complex things with it, it just, for me, and it might not be everyone here, but for me, personally, it goes off the rails fairly quickly when I have to burn brain CPU cycles on details that I'd rather be burning elsewhere. So I was concerned when moving to Python, when moving to pyinfra, but not just pyinfra, I was looking at other programs in the same space. I was concerned, am I just swapping one program from another, one problem for another? But I don't feel that's quite the case. Again, it's more the power of abstraction that you get from Python and being able to express problems in Python. So I converted that script, that playbook, to pyinfra. And as I said, pyinfra, basically the inventory and the deploy scripts, what its versions of playbooks are, for all intents and purposes, Python. So first up is the inventory. So for my example, this is the inventory.py that we pass into pyinfra. It's just basically a list of servers. Normally it's just a straight list of servers. I actually like my running dialogue as things are running to be reasonably clean, so you don't have to pick through the error messages. So I like my server name short and my SSH host name's long. So basically when pyinfra runs, it knows that the host that it has to connect to, known as server 1, is actually server1.example.com, and so on. You can pass other variables in, you can assign other variables into this. These are just the ones that I needed for the purpose. The upshot this though is that it's executable Python code, so you can use something like requests and grab your inventory from a convenient JSON server that's located nearby that has all your stuff there. If it doesn't come back in the format that's like this, you can munge it within the script. You don't have to write a separate inventory source as you would do with Ansible. You can actually do it. It's Python. You can do it as is. So pyinfra, when running this, it's just concerned about prod servers. It basically any variable that's set in the module space, it uses as the inventory. So you can have prod servers, you could have dev servers, and they'd be selectable from the command line as well, or it'll just execute against the lot. I'll come back to @local shortly. But @local, as I said before, it's basically saying I want to connect to the local server, not via SSH. But sorry, I won't come back to it I'll come back to it right now. The reason we do that is that pyinfra doesn't have the concept of a delegate to. So when the previous playbook had a delegate to say, I need you to run this on the local host, pyinfra doesn't have that, but it just lets you run your playbook against local host anyway. And we have group files as well, same as Ansible, so almost feature complete for that. And this is basically saying, this is the SSH user, which isn't my user, in case any of you are thinking about trying to hack any of my framework, and the key, which none of you have either. But I'll be sure to commit that to GitHub later. Interesting bug, and it's probably worth keeping, and this will be uploaded to the repository. Interesting bug, Paramiko and modern versions of Debian and Ubuntu SSH servers can't negotiate, can't play nicely. There's a couple of algorithms there that it tries to use and then dies badly, but it's a simple matter to disable those and to say, just exclude these algorithms in your initial setup and negotiation, and then go nuts. The last line, that's also a Paramiko thing. Paramiko just uses your local, your personal home directory SSH known hosts by default. Holy dooly, I am so sorry. Have you waved that 5-minute thing at me yet? You did? Sorry about that. Speed run. I apologize for this because this is what I swear I wouldn't do. The deploy script proper. This is the deploy script. The deploy script only needs to execute on the local host. And this is, as you can see, pure Python. I grab some bits from pyinfra that I need. I also grab some bits from help script that I need. And then I sit there and I go, right, I need to slurp up all the keys from all the hosts that aren't me, hence the iname does not equal that local, and the ones I've successfully connected to. So if there's any servers offline, it skips over them as well. It grabs the connection IP, the SSH host name, and then executes that fact, SSH known host keys. It then sits there and creates all the host names based on that, so that's the fully qualified domain name with and without the dot, and the connection IP, and then bungs that all into a list of lists. And then it calls SSH known host subset, which sits there and passes that all off to the SSH host module, which is the operation that pyinfra runs. So it does that, tells you the name of the path to the SSH known host you want to update. Name is the descriptive field that comes up as it's running, so you can so you know what it's doing in the play. And of course, we need sudo access to do that. So just say, give me sudo, or give me death. I have cheated slightly, but to be fair, Ansible started it. Ansible has a lot of built-in facts and modules that we can leverage on that we do not have. So I've actually had to write 2 facts and an operation. And I'm going to really speed run through this. This is a fact. These are very simple. These are so simple. I've spent no time thinking about writing these, as it should be. Again, this is the problem that I was trying to solve. I do not want to be thinking about how to solve these problems. I want to be thinking about the problem that I'm trying to solve in Ansible. Well, sorry, the automation problem, not in Ansible. No. A fact is basically, we derive it from what's called fact base, which is just the superclass. There's 2 methods that we need to implement. Command, which in this case there is a helper script that pyinfra supplies that just lets us go, hey, we just want to cat the output of all those files. And then there's a process which it runs, which basically grabs the output of all those files, which is executed across SSH, brought back, and then we just go, hey, do with it whatever. And what I'm doing with it here is basically just returning a dictionary that says this is the key type, this is the key value, and that gent says 1 minute. But this is the thing, is that the fact is structured in a way that helps me solve the problem that I'm trying to solve. I'm going to skip over the next fact. But I should note, Right. And then this is the operation. The operation is basically it grabs all the data that you've collected and then sits there and, well, what I'm doing here is irrelevant. Skip that. But we need to basically say in the SSH known keys files, we need to delete keys, we need to append keys. We sit there and we work over. We do basically technical mumbo jumbo. Don't need to care about it. But what we do at the end is we go, for all the lines that I want to delete out of the key file, this is the sed command I want to execute. For all the keys I need to append, these are the keys I need to append. And if I've made any of those changes, it's almost up. If I have made any of those changes, then I need to use SSH keygen to sit there and reformat the output, to rehash the output. And I think I'm done. And I apologize. 30 seconds? Go, right. There will be no questions. If you do 2 -v operations to pyinfra when you run it, you get to see the commands that it spits out over. The top commands are the facts, that it's the shell commands that it executes for the facts. The bottom commands are the ones that the output of the operation that I ran. And that shows you, yep, exactly what it is it's doing. If you use 3 -vs, it actually sits there and shows you the, the response from those commands coming back. This is great for debugging. Any lessons learned? Yes, time I talked more properly. No questions. This time we're really done. I apologise, sorry.
Honestly, pretty good speed run.